In this video, I'll be talking about Laowa's brand new Argus 33mm f0.95 for Fujifilm. Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel and welcome back to another gear short. In this week's video we're going to be talking about Laowa's brand new 33mm f0.95 and just where it fits into the lineup of normal, quote-unquote normal lenses that you can get for APS-C cameras and specifically Fujifilm X cameras. Now we're used to seeing ultra wide angles or super macros from Laowa, but this is the first time they have released an ultra fast aperture lens. So let's take a look at how this performs today. Now full disclosure, Laowa did send me this lens for review. They haven't asked me to say anything specific about it. I'm not being paid. I will be sending this lens back tomorrow now that this video is done. So let's jump in and I'll give you my thoughts, the good, the bad, and how it might compare to some other options on the market. In the Fujifilm X space, Fujifilm themselves actually offer two great 35mm options. So you have the 35mm f1.4 and the 35mm f2, both of which are autofocus and have excellent performance. So if autofocus is one of the primary concerns for you, this lens is definitely not going to be one of the ones that you want to look at. But up until now, in terms of a very high quality, fast third-party lens in the 35mm range for Fujifilm cameras, there really has only been one option, and that was the Zhongyi Mitacon f0.95, the 35mm. And Laowa have, I think, in my opinion, outdone that lens in almost every way. Now, I've owned the Mitacon twice, and I've sold it twice because it had a couple of little things, some weird flare here and there, a very, very loose focus ring, and an aperture ring that just sort of drifted at times or was very, very easy to knock. And Laowa have done a great job on the build quality of this, and the optical quality, especially when you consider that it's an f0.95 lens, is excellent. So let's take a look at some samples and discuss what I've found while using this lens. Before we jump into the optical quality and the interesting sort of rendering that this lens has, let's take a quick look at the build quality. Now, this is going to be a fairly heavy lens. I believe it's 490 grams in total. It is all metal and glass. There are no sort of composite materials that are going to make this very, very lightweight. It definitely feels solid in the hand, and if you're on something like, say, an X-T4, it is going to be a little bit front heavy, so you're going to want to support the camera and lens with your left hand while you're shooting. Now, when it comes to metal bodies on lenses, I'm not always a fan of having a metal focusing ring or a metal aperture ring because they tend to get a bit slippery, especially as you get sweaty or if any moisture gets on the lens. But the grooves on this are really, really deep and it's quite easy to turn. Now, the focusing ring itself actually has a really, really long throw. It's almost 360 degrees. I'm not sure the exact number, but basically you have to spend a lot of time turning it all the way around to go from infinity back out to, I think, 35 centimeters. Yeah, 35 centimeters is the minimum focusing distance. So really, really good when it comes to being able to precise focus at f0.95. Now, especially for our video comrades, this is going to be a really nice focus ring. It's got a lot of tension, so very precise movements are very, very easy to do. But it's not going to lend itself to, say, whipping from 35 centimeters all the way out to infinity if you want to go from shooting a flower to a street shot or something like that. You're really going to need to spend some time turning this around. So it's definitely aimed at that sort of precise focusing, whereas I think one of my big complaints with the Mitacon was that it was actually, you could almost just flick it with your finger and the focus ring would just turn around and get you all the way from end to end. So this is definitely a little bit better for that precise focusing. Now, the aperture ring feels quite similar. It's a little bit looser than the focus ring, and it is a declicked aperture ring. So again, something that people are going to like if you're doing video. It does go from f0.95 out to f11. Now, missing f16 or f22 might be something that some people don't like, but with an APS-C sensor, I mean, we're very rarely going to go past f11 anyway. Just because diffraction starts to kick in and we're going to lose sharpness. Now, you might want that for, say, long exposures or something like that, but in that case you can just add an ND filter and it's not really an issue. The one thing that Laowa does include with this is a lens cap, because they do have quite a nice square metal hood on the front of here, which let's talk about that for a moment. Fujifilm, the lens that I'm filming on right now, is the 35mm f1.4, and Fuji includes this sort of flimsy aluminium hood with that lens, and I've bought 2 of those spares now because it seems that even in your bag it can just get bent and it no longer fits on the lens properly and things like that. Laowa have done a good job of making a slightly heavier but much more sturdy square lens hood for this. And they do give you this plastic lens cap, much like what Fujifilm does, and much like Fujifilm's, it just falls off and you might as well not even take it with you. So you can actually hear it rattling around. It is a plastic one rather than Fujifilm's rubber one. So basically you just slide that off, or if it's in your bag it's likely going to slide off for you anyway, so you won't need to take it off when you go out. So this is one of those things that I probably just leave at home when I do get this lens, which I probably will as soon as I get a little more work. Okay, so let's talk some technical optical qualities before we get into the interesting stuff. Now, sharpness. At f0.95, especially in this price bracket, you don't have to expect too much, and the Laowa definitely outperforms in that respect. At 0.95, it's very much usable. Now, it's going to be a little bit difficult to focus. It will take a little bit of getting used to being able to focus with such a wide aperture, but once you do, you can get some really quite sharp shots out of this. When it comes to about f1.1 or about f2, you start getting much, much better. And by f2, I'd say it's about as good as you would need it to be. The corners themselves get a little bit soft out until about f4, but you're not going to be putting much in the corners of a frame with a lens like this anyway. It's typically going to be used as maybe a portrait lens or a close-up lens or something like that, where corner-to-corner sharpness isn't always the main concern. Now, there is quite a significant vignette wide open. I found it to be about 1.7 stops at f0.95, so you are going to have to be a little bit careful if you plan to recover those areas in post-production, that you don't let your corners get too dark. So almost 2 stops under the middle means you might actually need to overexpose the center of your frame while you're working, just so that you can actually recover those shadows in the corners when you get back into post-production. So something to be aware of, but not something that's really going to worry you. I mean, we use a lens like this because of its character, not so much because of its perfect performance in the corners and things like that. So the headline feature with this lens in its name is that it is an apochromatic design. Now, what that basically means is that we're going to be reducing chromatic aberrations as much as possible. Now, it's important to remember that we're not looking at a $5,000 massive Zeiss Otis lens. We are looking at a $500 quite small lens for APS-C, so we shouldn't be expecting that sort of level of chromatic aberration reduction, but it definitely does a good job. Now, in normal shooting, I haven't really seen any color fringing around the edges of most subjects. I did find a little bit of green or purple fringing around branches against a dark sky, but for an f0.95 lens, really, really well controlled. Now, I had to push it to the point of photographing, rippling water with the sun setting over it to be able to see any significant amount of color fringing. So pretty impressive, especially when you compare it to the other super fast offerings for the Fujifilm X system. That's enough about technical image quality. When it comes to a fast aperture lens like this, what we're really looking for is an interesting rendering, something that's going to add a little bit of pizzazz to our images. Not something that's technically perfect, but something that's interesting, something that's going to draw your eye into what you're photographing. So first of all, let's talk about the bokeh with this. When shooting in close, you're going to get extremely smooth bokeh, especially when it comes to things like foliage. So if you're shooting a portrait in the forest, or for example, like what I've been doing recently, some close-ups of flowers and things, you're going to get absolutely beautiful soft rendering around those subjects. And of course, when you're working wide open, you get that lovely vignette to come around as well. The next thing I noticed as I took this out to photograph the flowers at sunset was that if you point this directly into a light source, you are going to get those blazing red rings that come around the light source. So if you can get the sun in the right position in your frame, or a flash or a street light or something like that, you can definitely create these beautiful big red rings around your subject. This is not to everyone's taste, but for me, this is one area where it really outshines the Mitacon. When I was using the Mitacon, I'd often have to be very careful around bright light sources like the sun, because you would get these almost shards of light and laser beams that come across the frame, and while they could be interesting at times, I often had to find myself shielding the lens just to avoid those. Whereas with the Laowa and getting those beautiful red rings, I've found myself actively seeking out light sources to point the lens at because I really like the effect. Another thing that happens when you get a bright light source very close to the side of the frame is that you start to get this hazy flare across the image. Now, depending on where that light source is, it might cover about half the image or even the whole image. And for me, I've found this really interesting when shooting things like street scenes, to be able to get that sort of old-timey kind of feel. It's a very washed out look that you might expect from like a faded film photo or something like that. So that's one of the things that I was also trying to look for a lot when I started working with this lens, was just take that hood off, get as much light hitting that flat front element as possible, and just get that nice haze. It's important to note that both of these effects, the red rings and the hazy flare, only happen when the lens is used wide open. The moment you stop down to f1.1, they disappear. So if you're looking to get that sort of thing, it's important to remember that you're not going to get the best technical performance out of this lens. You are going to get that big vignette and it's going to be slightly softer, but you will get that really interesting rendering. So definitely a lens that you'll want to use wide open quite a bit. When you do start to stop down, however, Laowa has done a really good job at making sure this still produces nice sun stars. Now, unlike something like their 17mm for the GFX or some of their other wide-angle lenses, you're not going to get those perfect sharp sun stars out of this lens. The edges of them are a bit softer, and it's a really beautiful rendering for, say, a portrait with a sun star in the background. It's not going to distract from your subject as much as something like a wide-angle lens sun star might. As you might have noticed from the way that I've been talking about this lens, I've really enjoyed my time with it. And basically the only thing left for me at this point is to convince my wife that I need to put $500 into a new lens at this time. We'll see how that goes, and hopefully I'll be able to convince her and pick one up for myself. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about this lens, I've got a link below to Laowa's page where they have a whole bunch of technical specs, MTF charts, sample images that you can check out, so head over and take a look at that. As always, please leave any questions that you might have about this lens, or maybe a comparison between it and the Mitacon, in the comments below. I'd be happy to try and answer them if I can. If you've enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. We'll see you in the next one.